Welcome to another episode of The Places Where We Belong, written and read by Brett Wallach, a retired geography teacher in Norman, Oklahoma. I stand alone in the graveyard, sheltering under my umbrella. Poor descriptive economic geography, dead and just about forgotten. Economic geographers today worship at the altar of theory and are contemptuous of description, or as they would say, mere description. I think of Jack Webb, the star of the old TV cop show Dragnet. Do you remember that line he must have said 100 times? Just the facts, ma'am. And so I watch the antics of Ryanair and the meteoric success of AirAsia. I try to keep up with IKEA's efforts to set up shop in India. I'm curious about cement plants in Nigeria and supermarkets in Brazil. I watch shopping centers die in the United States and online shopping flourish in India. I marvel as Dubai actually manages to sell itself as paradise. I hypothesize nothing, but one simple idea did emerge a few years ago while I was stopped at a traffic light. This was in Norman, Oklahoma, the college town where I live. I was right up there at the intersection and had a fine view of 6 lanes crossing 4 lanes and taking up a square measuring about 100 feet by 100 feet. Call it a quarter acre of painfully white concrete. 2 of the corners had drugstores. One belonged to Walgreens and the other to CVS. In other words, 2 of the corners were occupied by the biggest pharmacy chains in the world. A third corner was occupied by a bank. I don't remember its name, but Norman has about a dozen of them. A few are national, but most are local. Some have 2 or more locations. They come and go. We are overbanked, I tell myself, but I must be wrong. Until a couple of years ago, the 4th corner was occupied by a restaurant selling fried chicken for lunch and dinner. I think it was fast casual. Anyway, it was a chain, and as chains eventually do, it broke. The building sat vacant for a couple of years and was then demolished. I thought we might get another bank, the more the merrier. But no, we got a dentist's office. It looks like a small-town railway station in the Old West, and it prominently displays a full-sized model of a 19th century steam locomotive. It's made of wood, except for the bell, and it is nicely done. The office is open 6 days a week, but the owner is off somewhere, building a multi-state chain of what he calls dental depots. The Norman office is run by a pair of young dental school graduates. Every year or so, the names on the signboard change. Waiting for the light in front of me to turn green, I realized that everything in my line of sight had been built to make money. I mean that if you took away everything made for money, there would be nothing left. I suppose you could argue that the concrete paving hadn't been poured to make money, but I would reply that it had been poured so the town's merchants could make money. If you're feeling tart this morning, you'll compliment me on my analytical prowess. Well, thanks. I do know that the world runs on money. That's not even an elementary fact. It's a preschool fact, even part of the toddler curriculum. Pity the children. But then, next to this vision of a world made for money, I remember 35 years ago turning down an invitation to visit the Taj Mahal. It's a tourist trap, I said. Well, it is a tourist trap, but one winter dawn a dozen years later, I went to Agra and saw the Taj rise, levitate, like a flying carpet momentarily paused. You might say I was hallucinating or was simply deceived by the drifting fog. Fair enough, but at that moment I realized that at least some tourist traps can be magical if you time your visit right. Since then I've managed to visit Khajuraho and Konark, Ranakpur and Ramappa, Sarnath and Sanchi, Badami and Bhubaneswar. Seeing these places, I have sometimes whispered to myself, "That's incredible." A few seconds later, I'm slightly embarrassed to realize that I'm echoing the strapline under the glossy ads coming from India's Ministry of Tourism. See the contrast. The Taj Mahal wasn't built to make money, nor just upstream on the other side of the river behind the Taj was the much quieter tomb of Itamad-ud-Dawla, the grandfather of Shah Jahan's wife. Nor were the vast majority of the houses in the thousands of villages stretching from Agra down the Ganges all the way to Calcutta and the sea. I think it is a very big deal when societies shift from doing things to live, building a house, plowing a field, baking a loaf of bread, to doing things to make money. It's a big deal because the change affects not only the landscape, but us ourselves. If you don't believe me, I'd like to share 4 lines from an essay called Is There an Indian Way of Thinking? It was written by A.K. Ramanujan, son of a mathematician. I find his words difficult, so I'm going to read them very slowly. To describe the exterior landscape is also to inscribe the interior landscape. What a man has, he is. The landscape which he owns, in which he lives, represents him. Represents there is with a hyphen after the R-E, so it's represents him. It is his property in more senses than one. If I understand him correctly, Ramanujan is telling me that I am the mirror image of the stuff around me. And what is that stuff? Sure, it's that tedious corner with the drugstores, but it's lots of intangible things too. Monday through Friday, for example, the radio tells me over and over that the stock market is up a few points or has declined sharply or has skyrocketed or is struggling. I almost feel sorry for journalists struggling for a new word. What does it say about us if our minds are invaded daily by the S&P 500? What does it say if we literally incorporate news stories about Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, Christine Lagarde, Mark Carney, and so many others? I don't even have an account at a brokerage, yet I and many millions of my fellow citizens incorporate this financial chatter into our brains. As Ramanujan suggests, that stuff is physically inscribed, that's his word again, somewhere in my cerebral cortex. It's a little scary. Ramanujan makes me think that not only am I living mostly in a world made for money, but that I myself am becoming money. Hey, ice cream's on sale. Look, mortgage rates are down. Ugh, this damned explanation of insurance benefits is wrong. On my computer, I can delete such trash, but I can't do it from my skull. Someone says, you are what you eat. But now I'm thinking, I am everything I'm aware of. Here's the implication. If I hunger for something besides a world made from money, I'm really hungering for a self that is not made of money. Now, this isn't black and white, and I don't want to go overboard. A few minutes ago, for example, I was weeding my garden, which I certainly didn't do for money. Yosemite wasn't made for money. Neither was Arlington National Cemetery. One of the best things about India is that it lags far behind the United States in this race to build a world made for money. But let's not go overboard in the other direction. What's behind Delhi Land and Finance, if not the money chase? What else is behind Mukesh Ambani's refineries in Gujarat, or the plans of Lakshmi Mittal and Anil Agarwal to invest billions in India's steel and aluminum industries? What else is behind all those whip-smart young Indians fighting to get into an institute of technology and praying a bit later for a green card? Well, what shall we do? Deplore or celebrate the world made for money? The answer, of course, is yes. I've lived most of my life in a country saturated, or at least once saturated, with Christianity, and that religion teaches that the love of money is the root of all evil. Even agnostics and atheists living in a nominally Christian country believe this teaching to be at least marginally true. Yes, the media dotes on billionaires barely out of short pants, but that's the young talking to the young about the young. Step back and remember that Commodore Vanderbilt was a pirate. Andrew Carnegie was perhaps marginally redeemed by paying for the construction of thousands of libraries. John D. Rockefeller wasn't so lucky, and despite his philanthropic foundation remains a desiccated symbol of rapacity. Today we continue to hate giant companies and their bosses. Not all of them, you say, not everybody, you say. But I say that Hollywood knows us best, and for good reason isn't interested in producing a movie whose hero is the CEO of a mighty corporation. Yet, and here's the other side, we are well and truly stuck with these titans and the world they've given us. And it's a good thing. I mean, for example, that the world uses about a cubic mile of oil annually. If you think there's an energy crisis now, wait until we can't fill that tank. I know, children want to stop oil now. But only children seriously think that all our wind turbines and solar panels are going to be made by village blacksmiths. Grown-ups understand that we'll just be swapping out one corporate monster for another corporate monster, one perhaps greener. Similarly, my wife hates Walmart. I tell her that Walmart, like Aldi and others, is a lifesaver for the poorest people in 1,000 towns. She's unimpressed. She hates Monsanto too, and if I'm looking for a fight, I tell her that if all the farmers in the world suddenly adopted traditional methods of growing heirloom varieties, we would, within a year, find ourselves in a global famine. The brutal fact is that we want and need these money maniacs and the world they create. That's just as well, because we sure aren't going to stop them. I recall the words of Stéphane Dion, a former Canadian Minister of the Environment. A few years ago he said that no force on earth, certainly no puny Minister of the Environment, could stop the development of Alberta's tar sands. His words remind me of Steve Call's book called Private Empire. It's about ExxonMobil, a descendant of Rockefeller's baby. Call is discussing the attacks on company properties by separatist rebels in Indonesia. And he quotes the American ambassador to Indonesia asking the rebels, "Do you really want us as an enemy?" It's unclear if the us is ExxonMobil or the U.S. government, but how much daylight is there between those two anyway? Tired of my picking on the United States? No problem. If there's one thing that threatens the Chinese Communist Party's grip on power, it's failing to put more money in the pockets of average Chinese. And it's not just China. If there's one thing that threatens India's Congress Party even more than corruption, it's failing to deliver on promises of water, roads, and electricity. James Carville, Bill Clinton's electoral strategist, had it about right when he said, "It's the economy, stupid." Translation, "It's the money, stupid." It's true pretty much everywhere. Corporate bosses make fine targets, but they are merely agents of the real enemy. In the immortal words of Pogo, that nearly forgotten comic strip, we have met the enemy, and it is us. And so I recall my first visit to Delhi in 1980. The city was then building its first flyovers. I don't remember much traffic, and the only cars on the road were lumbering ambassadors and putt-putt Fiats. A decade later, I could walk into the Avis office on Barkamba Road, pick up a self-drive Maruti, and tootle off to Hisar or Meerut or Agra. On one of those trips, I visited Gurgaon, best known at that time for the Gurgaon Experiment, a rural development project of the 1920s. Some of you perhaps remember Frank Brain, the district collector in those years. His tombstone in the Norfolk village of Ashel reads, "I am among you as he that serveth." I doubt it seemed that way to Gurgaon's villagers, whom Brain browbeat into digging latrines and buying bullocks so big that the villagers couldn't afford to feed them. The experiment came to a quick end with Brain's departure. I wonder what he would make of today's Gurgaon, a contender for the title of Ground Zero for an India made for money. On another of these self-drive expeditions, I visited Rani Kara on the Rohtak Road. I went there because in the 1950s, the American anthropologist Oscar Lewis had chosen it for a book-length study of Indian village life. Rani Kara was conveniently close to Delhi, Lewis explained, but it was still more or less separate from it. 40 years later, in the early 1990s, Rani Kara had a few cars parked in front of the bigger houses, and property developers had posted signs of things to come. Google Earth tells me now that there is no open space between Ranikera and Delhi. The hero of an action movie could jump from rooftop to rooftop all the way to Chandni Chowk. And yet, we still try to escape the world made for money. Think of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, that book from 1941 in which a very young James Agee writes an almost stupefyingly detailed description of an Alabama sharecropper's cabin. Agee is struggling to free himself from the Manhattan office where he is a tiny cog in Henry Luce's publishing empire. Agee is trying to get on paper what it feels like to be in a building not made for money. Of course, Luce declined to publish Agee's piece, which Agee later expanded into the book. Tolstoy, in Anna Karenina, has his hero, Levin, escape the world made for money by picking up a scythe and happily mowing hay. Mark Twain, in Life from the Mississippi, ruefully remembers that the Mississippi was beautiful until Captain Bixby taught Twain, who wanted to be a riverboat pilot, to see the river the way a plumber sees a clogged drain. Sarah Lloyd's An Indian Attachment, published in 1984, comes as close as any of these more famous books when she writes that the Sikh family she lives with in the Punjab occupies a house that the family had grown. That's her word. And she's thinking that all the materials in the building were either dug from or grown on the family's land. I can draw on my own experience, too, and recall a house that my wife and I rented in the 1970s. This was far northern Maine, a sparsely settled, hilly landscape with valleys so broad that the view from the house stretched northwest over perhaps 5 miles of fields and woods before it disappeared into Canada. This part of Maine was settled in the early 19th century by some of the Acadians who had been kicked out of Canada for refusing to swear loyalty to the British Crown. They settled down to remarkably self-sufficient lives, but during the Second World War their descendants became heavily dependent on potato production. Dragged into a world made for money, they eventually lost out to western states enjoying federally subsidized irrigation water. But the owner of the house I'm talking about, still in the 1970s, grew about 100 acres of round whites, no russets here, in rotation with the 100 acres of oats and buckwheat. He had about that much forest land, too. He had moved with his family into a new house up the road a bit, and I don't know what he thought about the one built by his great-grandfather. Its footprint measured about 20 feet by 30 feet, but a lean-to had been added on the north side for a kitchen and bathroom. The main part of the house had 2 stories, each with 4 rooms, and there was a full basement, stuffed each fall with 8 cords of firewood. You might not think that 8 cords would fit in such a space, but they could and did. The winters here are very long, with snow cover from late November into May without a break, and by May the wood was gone, reduced to ash in a simple wood-burning stove. The house stayed warm because the firewood was either sugar maple or American beech, both of which burn very hot. Also, the house stayed warm because its walls were solid planks 2 inches thick. I don't know, but suspect that the planks were sawn locally in a water-powered mill. In any case, they measured 2 inches by 10 and were stacked narrow edge on narrow edge, held together with inch-thick wooden pins inserted in holes drilled every few feet along the edge of each plank. Most Americans today would not give 10 cents for this house. They don't want to haul wood up from the basement every few hours, especially on a narrow and angled staircase under a ceiling that forces you to duck. They don't want windows that leak so much air that ice forms on the inside corners. They want a garage, not a nearby barn to park their car. And so, when we moved out, a bulldozer moved in. Instead of collapsing, the building just shuddered and moved intact off its stone foundation. It's painful to think about even now. Remember that classic sci-fi movie When Worlds Collide? You see, we have our own version. A shop opened a few years ago here in Norman. It offered various kinds of Indian foods, including a selection of metal foil pouches with things like Jodhpur lentils and paneer mekhni. You dump the pouch in boiling water, remove it 3 minutes later, cut the corner of the bag, and pour the contents into your bowl. I was looking for inspiration and asked the shopkeeper which of the items he recommended. But he said, "I don't eat any of them. My wife cooks proper meals for me." It won't surprise you if I say that his shop soon failed. But why was the shopkeeper repelled by these perfectly nutritious and carefully made products? I say it's because he preferred dinner cooked by somebody who was preparing a meal, not making money.